This is the Tascam DR-40X, and I guess it's time to do a review. Hey, Julian Kraus here, and this is the successor to the Tascam DR-40. It's the DR-40X, and this is a portable 4-track audio recorder with built-in stereo microphones. Let's have a closer look at the outside and some features, and then I will share my measurements of this device with you. So on the front you can find the display with your level meters and all kinds of different information regarding your current recording settings. To the right you got a peak LED, which is lighting up if any of the 4 audio channels is clipping. To the left you got a few more LEDs, which indicate in which mode you are currently in. Below the display you find 2 buttons which let you solo different channels or select a channel to change its gain. And you will also find another button which lets you change the recording mode. Below that you got your stop, play and record button, and below that you got quite a few more knobs to do things like navigating the menu, adjusting your headphone volume, and also access a quick menu, and of course forward and rewind in playback mode. On the bottom of the device you can find 2 XLR and TRS combo inputs and an input for an optional wired remote control. On the left side of the device you find a headphone jack and a selector which lets you change the inputs between line, mic and mic plus phantom power, depending on what you need to record with your inputs. I have to point out that in my opinion this is not the best solution because the selector controls both combo inputs simultaneously. So phantom power, for example, is always turned on or off for both inputs. And that's a bit unfortunate. I would have hoped for independent controls. Regardless, you will also find a hold slider which disables all the buttons, and this can, for example, prevent an unwanted stop of the recording when the recorder gets bumped unintentionally. Also on the left hand side there are 2 knobs which control the gain of the recorded channels. Not much stuff to see on the right. There is only the SD card slot and a micro USB connector for transferring data to a PC or using the DR-40X as an audio interface. On the top you can find the built-in microphones, and these can be used in either this XY configuration or you can flip them out and get more of an AB type setup. And I will demonstrate these mics later in the video. Finally, on the underside of the device you have your battery compartment, which takes 3 AA batteries. And next to that there is a 1/4 inch thread to connect your DR-40X to a tripod. So overall I think the button layout is quite intuitive, the menu is pretty easy to navigate and the quick menu button gives you easy access to the important functions. That said, I already have a few small gripes with the DR-40X. First of all, because of the locking XLR connectors, the release buttons are sticking out below the device. So Tascam put some big feet at the bottom to avoid laying the device on the release knobs. But this way the device is always slightly angled away from you when it is placed on a flat surface. To compensate, they give you this small rubber piece which you push into the 1/4 inch thread. But this thing really feels like an afterthought and it just barely stays in place, and I bet you will lose that thing in a few days. All the buttons have a tactile and clicky feel to them, and you definitely know when you press the button. And that can be a problem if you record with the built-in mics. You will hear every click, especially because the gain setting can only be adjusted with the 2 buttons on the side. I personally would have much rather liked to see a turnable knob for the gain setting here. The DR-40X does not directly show you your audio levels when you turn on the device. You have to hit record first to get into a standby mode where it shows you your level meter, and then you have to hit record again to get it to record audio. I think it should always show you your level meters, and when you hit record it should just record audio right away and not just go into this armed standby mode. I bet quite a few people will hit the record button thinking that it is recording when it is actually only in standby. Also, why micro USB? Come on, it's 2019. I think this connector should have been a USB Type-C. And lastly, I have to confess I'm not really impressed by the build quality. The whole device is made out of cheap plastic and it just feels cheap in hand. With that out of the way, let's have a closer look at the specifications of the DR-40X. Tascam states that the maximum sampling rate is 96 kHz and the bit depth 24-bit. With 96K sample rate, you can record frequencies way beyond the human hearing range, and this can be useful if you are recording special effects and want to slow down the recording and bring back the high frequencies into the audible range. And as you can see in my frequency response measurement, the DR-40X really has a flat frequency response throughout the human hearing range, and as expected it falls off steeply around 48 kHz. The 24-bit of this recording device theoretically enables you to capture a very high amount of dynamic range, so of course I measured the dynamic range, and that's the thing we are going to have a look at next. The dynamic range is the difference between the highest signal the audio recorder can capture without clipping and the device's noise floor, and you essentially want this to be as high as possible. The DR-40X has a dynamic range of 98 dB A-weighted, and that's a nice amount of dynamic range, which means that you can leave yourself quite a bit of headroom while recording without introducing any additional noise. Of course, this whole review is recorded with the DR-40X, and as you can see, this is my typical recording level for dialogue. I'm peaking around -18 to -12 dB, and with the amount of dynamic range the DR-40X provides, that's totally fine. Now let's have a closer look at the preamplifier noise of the DR-40X. I measured the equivalent input noise, and this results in a number which quantifies the preamp noise performance and makes it directly comparable to other devices. The DR-40X has an EIN of -108.3 dBu, and to be honest, that's a pretty bad value, meaning that the preamps in the DR-40X are quite noisy. I was a bit surprised by that because other portable recording devices have quite a bit lower noise preamps. For example, here you can see a Zoom F5, a Zoom F4 and a Mix Pre 3. As you can see, the DR-40X has by far the highest amount of noise, and here is how they compare audibly. Normally the preamp noise is only really important when you use dynamic microphones because they need such a high amount of gain. But with an EIN of -108.3 dBu, you are getting into a territory where the recorder is even adding noise to a recording with condenser mics. And in my opinion, that's unacceptable and nothing you should ever encounter in an audio recorder in the year 2019. I didn't have the chance to measure the predecessor, but I found a source online which has done this, and it is pretty much identical to the EIN I measured with the DR-40X. And this leads me to believe that they simply did not upgrade the preamps in this generation. Just to show you what kind of noise you can expect, I'm currently recording myself with a Shure SM57 dynamic microphone, which is plugged in straight into the DR-40X. And I will be quiet for a second to let you listen to the noise floor of this setup. I think we can all agree that this is a pretty high amount of noise, and that's far from professional audio recording. Of course, and then the question arises, does the DR-40X benefit from something like a fathead or cloud lifter? Yes, absolutely. When you, for example, use a fathead with the DR-40X, you can lower the preamp noise by a whopping 22 decibels. So if you have a fathead or cloud lifter laying around, you could use it to lower the preamp noise of the DR-40X. That said, I just think that the preamps of this recorder should have been better, so you wouldn't even need an inline preamp in the first place. Now, I also measured the provided gain of the DR-40X, and it comes in around 44 dBFS at 0 dBu, and that's a little lower than other devices, which are more around 50. Normally I would criticize this, but in this case, because of the high noise preamps, you can't really use low sensitive dynamic mics anyways, and you are forced to use condenser mics, so the lower amount of provided gain is not that critical. As always, I also checked the mic input impedance, because if this is too low, it can have an effect on your sound. But the impedance is around 2 kOhms, and that's still fine. I have to say that I was pretty excited when I saw that the DR-40X has built-in limiters, because such a feature can prevent your recording from clipping, and in some situations this really can save a recording. But my initial excitement vanished quickly when I tested the limiter and I realized that it is completely digital. When you activate the limiter, it essentially lowers the gain by about 5 dB. So you gain about 5 decibels of headroom, but you simultaneously lose 5 decibels of dynamic range. You could just turn down your gain a bit manually and get the same effect in post-processing with much more control over the limiter. So the limiter in the DR-40X is sadly not really useful. Okay, you are now listening to the built-in microphones of the Tascam DR-40X, and this is the sound quality you can expect from these mics. They are currently in the XY configuration, and as you can see, I had to put a pop filter in front of them, and that's because these mics are super sensitive to plosives and wind in general. So if you are planning on using the DR-40X outdoors, you have to find some kind of wind protection solution, because if there is just the slightest breeze, the audio will distort. Okay, now I changed over the mics to the AB configuration. As you can see, the mics are now pointed outwards, and this way you get more stereo separation between the two channels, and the recording will sound even more spacious. One thing I like is that every time you change the mic's configuration, the DR-40X notices it and asks you if you want to set up the left and right channel accordingly. So that's what you can expect from these built-in mics. Overall, I have to say the sound quality is pretty decent. I also did a test of the battery life of the Tascam DR-40X, and it is actually quite okay. I used 3 fully charged analog batteries and also connected 2 external phantom-powered mics. I then recorded with the 4-channel mode, so this is pretty much the worst case scenario. And the DR-40X had an average recording time of over 3.5 hours. Of course, if you would only use the internal mics or mics without phantom power, the recording time would be even longer. Now let's wrap this all up and start out with the positive things. The dynamic range with 98 dB is quite okay, and if you are recording line level signals, you can get very nice recordings. Also, the built-in mics sound quite good, and I like that you can switch between X, Y and AB mode. And the battery life of the DR-40X is pretty decent. Now onto the things that I didn't like. First of all, the build quality. The whole recorder has a distinctive plasticky feel to it, and every time I open the battery cover I fear that I'll break it. So the build quality is definitely on the lower end of the scale. Then there are a few smaller things which I mentioned in the beginning, like that you have to arm the recorder first and then hit record again to start a recording, and that you have to control the gain of all 4 channels with the 2 buttons on the side. And all these little things add up and make using the DR-40X a bit awkward. And lastly, the preamp performance is sadly not up to date. When you use dynamic microphones, you will get an audible noise floor, and even with condenser mics, the preamps add a few decibels of noise, which these days, in my opinion, is unacceptable. So all in all, I have to confess that I'm simply not impressed by the DR-40X, especially because there are already better alternatives out there. Okay, I hope you liked this little more detailed look at the DR-40X. Please give me a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos on audio and video gear. I will see you all in the next one.